The title of my lesson is The Magic of Forgiveness. The magic of forgiveness. And perhaps you might wonder, what magic could there possibly be in forgiveness, as painful as forgiveness appears to be at times? And I would remind you of the lesson last week in which I stressed the fact that there are really two levels of consciousness in each one of us. Now, those two levels have been described in many ways. Sometimes they've been called our higher self, our lower self. Each of those levels has its own value system. And the two value systems are quite distinct, amazingly different. You know that this is true because those times in your life when you were living in and from your higher self, you had glorious, even heavenly moments. As a matter of fact, you have a collection of such moments in your memory bank. The great moments. Those special times that we're always reaching for. All of our great moments come from our higher self. Perhaps you have an even larger memory bank of some of your lower moments. Some of the most embarrassing times. Angry times. Depressed times. Now, I'm not implying that you're that way all the time, but the point I wish to make is that there are two distinct levels of being existing in us. And if we wish to move from the lower to the higher, and we do, that's why we're here on this planet, to learn how to develop ourselves, to escape, so to speak, from our lower nature. It's important to understand forgiveness because we will not move one whit farther than we are on this upward path until we come to understand the nature of forgiveness. Mother was speaking the other day about hearing her 5-year-old boy screaming in the playroom, and when she ran in, she found that her baby daughter was pulling his hair. You know how a child will grab you by the hair and just hold on for dear life? And the 3-year-old had the 5-year-old and was just pulling his hair out, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs. And she said, "Never mind, your baby sister doesn't understand that it hurts you." She went out of the room, and about 2 minutes later, she heard another scream, and it was the 3-year-old this time, and she went running into the playroom and said, "What's the matter with the baby?" And the 5-year-old said, "Nothing much. Only now she knows." It's kind of like an eye for an eye, and we learn it young, don't we? That is a value system of our purely human condition. Now, listen to what Gustav Stromberg wrote. There is another and higher level of understanding than that given by our sense organs, our purely human self, and by our reasoning power. Our judgment of values belong to this deeper understanding. Although such judgments are expressed in linguistic form, in language, they're not based on reason. They are instinctive expressions of the imprisoned splendor within us all. The imprisoned splendor, our higher self, Christ, meaning the mind of God in every person, or Jesus said, "The Father within me, who does these things." He implied, and others have too, that there's something within each one of us that is greater than we are. There's something higher in each one of us. And for most of us, it is an imprisoned splendor. We don't let it out. We haven't released it. We haven't come yet to fully understand or to accept its value system. We're so caught up with our own value system, which is suffering, which is reacting to life, seeing ourselves as being purely human, and in no way coming to believe that God really does exist, and remarkably so inside ourselves. Gustav continued, our appreciation of beauty and goodness and our hunger for knowledge tell us unequivocally about the existence of a spiritual world of values which our intellect cannot fathom. And that's true. The purely intellectual self of us cannot understand, nor can it reach, nor can it experience our spiritual nature. But that doesn't mean that it is beyond our reach, because it is well within our reach. But in order to experience this higher something that is within us, we have to begin to feel or think like it does. And so listen to what some other people have had to say about this other self. Pythagoras, some 500 years before the time of Jesus, said, one mind runs through the universe. One mind permeates the whole universe. And he further said the soul, the human soul, is an emanation of the divinity, a part of the soul of the world, a ray from the source of light. In other words, that your beingness, your soul, the essence of you, that which you really are, if you could see yourself, is but a ray or an emanation of that higher self, that you really are an expression of the soul of the universe. And Albert Schweitzer said, just as white light consists of colored rays, so life, meaning the spirit of the universe, contains all the components of ethics, love, kindliness, sympathy, empathy, peacefulness, and the power to forgive. And I feel like that's a very important point, because your spirit and my spirit is really the same spirit. I was sitting at a table at a meeting in the fellowship area on Monday night, and there was a man at the table that I have known for a number of years. Someone else was speaking, and when they finished speaking, I turned to my friend of many years to ask the question, how long have we known each other? And before I could speak, he said, we've known each other for 15 years. Nothing in the conversation could possibly have given him a clue. You have these experiences all the time, don't you? One mind permeates the universe, and we are one with it. Now, when we become truly in tune with it, some amazingly beautiful and dramatically inspiring things begin to happen to us. So it's essential that we learn to forgive, because listen to the last quality that Albert Schweitzer said was indigenous to that higher mind, the power to forgive. Do you know that our purely intellectual self does not understand forgiveness? It's not capable of it. Our purely human condition is not capable of forgiveness. It is not. No. If you yank my hair, I will pull yours. You pull my string, and I will fix you pretty good. And if you, whatever it is that you do to me, I will not forget it, but I will cause you to remember it. That is the ethic of our purely human condition. So in order to escape from that condition, we have to come to understand something about forgiveness, because forgiveness is an empowerment. It's something that each of us has. And it's a wonderful something, because it's like an eraser on a pencil, or an eraser with which you would erase a large blackboard. How many of you have been told that at some time in your life that God had a large blackboard in the sky with your name and all those facts on it, or something about like that? Probably today it would be that God has the large computer in the sky, and you are very well positioned in the software. But I want you to know that if anybody has written anything on that blackboard, it was you. And if anyone erases it, it will be you. Because you have not been judged by God. When I say not been judged, this does not mean that God has not observed us very carefully, because infinite intelligence cannot fail to track the trajectory of its creation. God knows. But God also anticipated how we would be and could care less. It is we who have caused our own suffering. We don't need a devil to do that. We are so devilish ourselves that we have managed to do quite well at causing the pain that ultimately leads us to surrendering our old concepts about ourselves and about life. And if you're ready to forgive, it's because you've been experiencing some pain in your life. Now, there's a power principle or a power law in the universe, and that law is stated in many ways in many scriptures, and it is that what we sow or give is what we reap or receive. That's a law. What we send out comes back, right? And if we send out love, love comes back. There was a time in my life when a long time in my life, when I really wanted to be loved. Oh, I desired to be loved. I hungered to be loved. And I'm quite sure it was because when I was a small boy, I was orphaned, and I did not receive the love that many children receive. I can recall walking to school many, many days in my life, not stepping on the cracks in the sidewalk and wondering if anybody would ever love a little boy like me. And that's okay for little boys. But let me tell you, when I was an adult, I was still not stepping on the cracks in the sidewalk wondering, is anyone going to love a little boy like me? And I was still that little boy who was not loved. And do you know that you do not become loved seeking to be loved? Did you know that? Those who stand in the corner waiting to be loved become unlovable. Very unlovable. Because in time, you begin to resent the people who did not come to love you. You understand, don't you? Now, if one wishes to be loved, what is the only way that one can be loved? It's to become loving, right? Of course it's right. But loving, finding Mr. Gorgeous or Miss Beautiful and loving him or her and walking hand in hand into the fading sunset, is that how you do it? Is that love? Well, it might be, but more often than not it isn't. You know, oftentimes people fall in sex with each other. And they call it love, or they fall in sick with each other. You know, two half people looking for another person to make them whole, and that doesn't work. Love, the ethic of love, of that higher nature of us, loves every living part of creation. And so the instruction for those who would be loved, or those who would grow in consciousness, is to begin to love, to find the love that's in you. It's already there. You cannot love. You can only release the imprisoned splendor, the feeling that is in you, and you may shine its light upon objects in the world around you, but love is. Unforgiveness, the blaming and judging of other people, prevents us from experiencing love. If you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. The measure you give will be the measure you get. And from Ecclesiastes, the 11th chapter, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. And some people have often thought that meant if you will put your bread on the waters, in a few days it'll come floating back. And if you've ever done that, you know it doesn't work that way at all. You put bread on the water and it'll sink. So what could that possibly mean? Well, it was spoken by a nation of fishermen. and who would take their bread, the leftovers, and go down to the water and cast it in the water. And in time it would draw the fish. And then they would take their nets and catch the fish. And so the concept was, cast out your bread, and in time it will come back to you in the form of fish, in some different form. The good that you give, that you send out, will come back to you in some form that will be for your advantage at the moment that you receive it. But if you hold back your love, if you hold back the sending out, then that's what you get. Life withholds its good from us. And when we are unforgiving, this means that we're holding back from ourselves all the good, the joy, the happiness that that intuitively we desire. Probably the most perfect story that I've ever heard is the story in the 15th chapter of Luke about the prodigal person. It's not the prodigal son, it's the prodigal him and her, because we're all it. The prodigal is in each one of us. And you recall the story. A young man decided that he knew how to do it. He became full of himself. And he said, I will leave my father's house and go out and make it on my own. Now, his father's house represents a state of consciousness. And he went into a far country, and that doesn't mean that if he lived in Detroit that he had to cross over into Windsor. No, the far country is also in us. The far country is an attitude. It's a state of being. It is our purely human condition that all of us think that we will find our glory in. Admit it, you did. And the prodigal had the experience that we have either had or will. If you haven't had it yet, be patient, because it will come to you. And he found himself, as you know the story, the Jewish boy eating what the pigs left, and it was very painful. And he came to himself, and he said, I will arise. And if you read the story, you can tell that there was something very special happening in him. He was ready he surrendered. He just gave up. He stopped trying. He admitted his personal powerlessness. And he said, I will arise and go to my father and tell him how wrong I've been. And he did. And his father met him. And while he was still a long distance away, his father saw him coming and was filled with loving pity and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Now, notice how forgiving that is. Never once did his father accuse him or blame him or judge him. He accepted him. And that is a most wonderful example, I think, of a forgiving attitude. It is being able to see the defects and the shortcomings in a person, but reaching right through them and touching the spiritual part and pulling it forward and upward and embracing it in other persons. So many of you have heard my Garnet story that I hesitate to tell it again, but I don't know of a better way to talk about forgiveness than my Garnet story. Garnet was a brother-in-law, older than I, and he and I did not see eye to eye from the very beginning. And then in time I discovered that he had done something that I would have suggested that he not do. And it affected my life, and I began to think about it. As a matter of fact, I thought a lot about it. And I reached the place in my own mind that I hardly thought about anything else. And some of you are nodding your heads because you, too, have had your Garnet, and perhaps you still do. And time passed. And I let Garnet know how I felt. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's anyone in the county that did not know how I felt about Garnet. I had some plans for Garnet to fix him. And I do not mean to repair him. I mean to fix him beyond repair. And I almost did. I came that close to You see, anger and resentment are the insanity of the emotions. And they rob us. They are the robbers who rob us of the good that is ours. And you know that if I had harmed Garnet, I would have believed at the time that what I was doing was exactly right, and I would have wondered why you would have been appalled. Insanity. And time passed, and with that kind of consciousness, with that attitude, you know what happened to me in my life. I became the prodigal in that far country. And I came upon hard times. And no man gave me anything. And one day I prayed to a God who was unknown to me, a God in which I did not believe, and had an experience. But in the prayer that I prayed, a remarkable thing happened, because as I was praying a prayer to an unknown God, I forgave all of the people. I saw clearly that I had been my own enemy. And so I forgave everyone, every living human being except Garnet. It was not about to forgive Garnet. I'd spent too much time developing that attitude. And some wonderful things began to happen to me, and they did. My life changed dramatically. My belief system was altered so dramatically that I cannot describe it to you. And I came to understand what love and beauty and joy and peace and happiness are. And in the midst of all of this, one day, the voice that had spoken to me said, by the way, Jack, you forgot Garnet. And the time has come to forgive Garnet. And I said, I will not do it. And the voice said, yes, you will. And there was some mind wrestling that took place for a few moments, and then the magic words were spoken to me in my own mind, and I was told that forgiveness of Garnet was not for Garnet, it was for me. That I would not advance one step beyond where I was. I would not understand one thing beyond what I understood, and that all that I gained would ultimately be lost. And I knew it. But I still didn't want to forgive Garnet. Do you understand? Of course you do. Because there were two sides of me, two value systems, each vying for prominence in my mind. And so I told God that no one could forgive Garnet. and God told me that God had, and that I would. Now I hope you don't think I'm putting you on. I'm telling you about a conversation that took place. And I said, well, I would if I knew how, but I don't know how. Now that's the point of this whole story. I want to tell you how to forgive your Garnet. It's the easiest thing in the world if you will make the decision to do it. I was given an image in my mind of my youngest son, Alan, who was 2 years old at the time, with long curly red hair that had never been cut, and the most wonderful smile on his face. And I just loved Alan. And I was told to take Alan in my arms, either actually or mentally, and just love him. And when I loved him so much that I could hardly stand it, and that was easy to do, then to switch the feeling to Garnet. And I did, and it quit, and I said, see, it doesn't work. See, I did not know at the time that the unconscious mind cannot tell the difference between a real and an imagined experience. And that what was happening was that when I began loving Alan, I was shifting into my higher state of mind. That part of me whose ethic is love for all persons. And what was Alan but a catalyst? My son was but the catalyst for that love. And so I switched that feeling of love to Garnet. And day after day, I worked at it. Day after day for weeks. And one day, I switched it to Garnet, and it didn't quit. I didn't really like him. But I began to understand him. And I worked with it. And one day, I loved him. I loved him. And it makes me cry. I loved him. It was as though I stood in his shoes. It was as though I had walked in his very footsteps. I could understand everything he had done and why he had done it. And I would have taken all the pain away from him if I possibly could. And I went to him and made my amends to him for the pain that I had caused him. And it was one of the most glorious days of my life. Now, if you have an acute or chronic Garnet syndrome in your life, that is a system that you can use. And I guarantee it'll work, because I've known scores of people who have tried what I told you, and it will work if you choose it to do so. At about that same time in my life, I developed another system of working with irritating persons and circumstances. Do you know what I mean by irritating persons and circumstances? I had learned that there are really two activities of the mind. One is thinking, and the other one is feeling. And that thinking is something that takes place in your head, probably, and feeling is in your heart or in your stomach. When you are in love with someone, it's not in your head. Have you noticed that it's right here? And when you feel great moments of joy or of passion, they almost double you over. You have felt those butterflies in your stomach, haven't you? I've never heard anyone say, I feel those butterflies in my head. They're in my stomach. And most of my problems, therefore, are in my stomach, because of my negative emotional responses and my fear responses. And so I learned then, if I would do what I called focusing, I focused my attention in my stomach, right here in my solar plexus. For example, if I had to make a call on an important customer and I was frightened of him, a tough guy, if I really needed to get that order, to get his approval, I would focus on how I felt. And something wonderful oftentimes would happen to me. It was like I relaxed. I could walk in. If I walked in not so much thinking, but feeling my way. I used to feel my way, and that's what I would call it. I would feel my way into a situation. Or if I had a reaction to a driver on the highway or someone that I met, I would, as quickly as I could, focus my attention to change my emotional response. And in time it became much, much easier to do. And it was like magic. It was like an empowerment from on high. And I discovered that I could totally change my reaction to irritating persons and circumstances. That things that had bothered me and disturbed me yesterday or last month hardly bothered me, and then in time did not bother me at all. And I worked with this, and still do, over all the years of my life. And so I chose to focus. Now, this past September, we had a delightful young man here to bring us his book that was just released, The Magic of Conflict. And of course, I'm talking about Thomas Crum. And he talked about virtually the same system that I've just shared with you, except he called it choosing to be centered. Remember when Tom was here? And in his book, he talks about choosing to be centered, and he said, notice that it doesn't say try or hope to be centered. Do it. To make the decision to be centered. And centered means to really focus your attention here in your solar plexus area. Really, it's lower than that. First, let me make a point. Physicists will tell you that there is a center of gravity to every object on this planet. For example, if you could lift this building, if your arm was strong enough, and if your index finger was rigid enough, there's a certain point somewhere in this building, underneath it, that you could balance it perfectly on your finger. Did you know that? There is a point where it balances. There is a point of balance in each one of us, and it's about 2 inches below the navel. When you're standing, it's about 2 inches below your navel. And there is a strange and wonderful phenomenon that takes place, and you can prove it to yourself if you will focus your attention right here. I've done it for years, and since Tom was here, I've been even more specific about that particular area. But let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I've been learning to ski the last 3 years. Now, I suppose that if you learn to ski when you're a child, that there's virtually no fear that's involved. But if you learn to ski out in Colorado when you're my age, there's some rather steep slopes out there. And they're a whole lot steeper looking down than they are looking up. They are much steeper from the top, or so it appears. And one of the phenomena that I discovered about skiing is the tendency to lean away from what appears to be the danger. Have you noticed how that is? And that will surely throw you every time that you do it. It will throw you. As a matter of fact, the principle is to lean into that which you fear. It's to lean downhill. And when one becomes centered, that's precisely what you can do. It takes the fear away. But it's more than taking the fear away. You see, when one becomes centered, the phenomena is this. You discover your inner skier. You know there's something in you that does not have to learn how to ski? It already knows. I have had some incredible moments of skiing when I became centered. I'm talking about I have amazed myself. But when I was amazing myself, I realized that it was not I who was amazing myself. There was something in me that was skiing for me. Do you know that on the same day, on the same slope, I have had two totally opposite, remarkable experiences in skiing? By totally opposite, I mean not making it at all and doing so well that I could hardly believe it. And the only question was, who is doing the skiing? So let me ask you, who is doing the forgiving? Who is doing the loving? Who is doing what needs to be done by you? And becoming centered is very important to understand that there is this other value system in us that can be touched, that can be called upon, that has a whole different personality, that walks through life differently, that sees other people differently, that sees them truly and responds in a new way. And that all of the great works that have changed the consciousness of mankind have been written by people who were centered. Listen, for example, to what Marcus Aurelius said. Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful, the envious, the unsocial. Those are the people I'm going to meet today. All these things happen to them by reason of their ignorance of what is good and evil. But I can neither be injured by any of them, nor can I be angry with my kinsman, nor hate him. Do you think he was centered or not? What part of his mind was he speaking from and living from? For we are made for cooperation, like feet, like hands. To act against one another, then, is contrary to nature. And it is acting against one another to be vexed and to turn away. A remarkable statement. Last week, we talked about the process of forgiving ourselves. And this week, we've talked about the absolute necessity of forgiving all other persons, without exception. Speak more about that in a moment. How important it is, and we're talking about the technique that ultimately brings us to the place that we don't have to forgive them because we don't accumulate vexation as a process. We forgive them as it happens. It's like that someone cuts in front of you on the expressway. Instead of the old reaction, you wave your hand and say hi, or move in ahead of me, it's all yours, and without being facetious about it. How would you like to be able to do that all the time and say, it's yours? After you, my friend, and mean it. Well, you can, because it's in you to be that way. And it's very important to be that way, because we will not reach the mountaintops of our own true selves until we can function momently in tune with the force that controls the universe. There is a force that for good in the universe, and we can be connected to it, and when we get into the flow of it, then we are at the right place at the right time, and we are responding to all things that are happening to us in a different way. And in this process, we do not lose our identity, we gain a new identity. Sometimes in the beginning, when we come in contact with this understanding, the tendency is to think, well, if this happens to me, I will know who I am. We will discover who we really are in that process. I have a friend I've known for many years. Her name is, this is not her name, but I'll use it. Her name is Lois. She grew up in Oklahoma. Beautiful, beautiful person. Part Indian, for whatever value that has. She made her way through college and was the queen of her college, and then ultimately the cotton queen in Dallas, Texas. A lovely, wonderful, sweet person most of the time, those days. Today she is a wonderful, sweet person all of the time. She has been here, seated right where you are on several occasions. And because of her understanding of spiritual principles, Lois is a much loved person, many friends around the country, and around the world, I would say, and a very wealthy person. She has homes in many parts of this country and in Europe and in other places, but a sweet person. A few years ago, she told me a story that happened to her. When she was first married, she and her husband were best friends with another couple. Really best friends, like couples sometimes are. And then one day she discovered that her husband and her best friend were having an affair. And she was devastated. She said that she felt that her reaction was so violent, that she was angered and hurt and wounded and felt cheated and robbed. And in order to get even, she went to her best friend's husband, who happened to be a minister, and told him what had happened. And both couples were divorced and moved away, and she did not see her former best friend for probably 20 years. And one day, in a city in which neither of them lived, she was on an elevator in a department store, and there was her former best friend on the elevator with her, not recognizing her. Her first thought was, how shall I react to her? In the old way, the old anger? No. Shall I just not look and get off the elevator as though I have not seen her? That's a choice. That's an option. Or shall I go up and speak to her and play a game of pretending that nothing ever happened? Or shall I go and speak to her and be the haughty, self-righteous person that I was when last we met? Which of those do you think she did? Neither. She stepped over and took her friend's hand and left her and said, will you have lunch with me? And at lunch, she made her amends to her friend, never one time mentioning ever what had been done to her. And of course, something magical began to happen. It is magic when we forgive people, when we let go of the resentments and of the hurts. When we let go of that small self of us that has blamed and judged and has chosen to suffer, believing that our suffering has come from other persons. Oh, how we cling to our wounds. And each one of us has had something special to cling to because it was the one that could not be forgiven. Do you understand that your hurt was the one that could not be forgiven? Not so. They can all be forgiven, and they must be forgiven if we're going to step into our higher state of mind. They must be. Jesus was talking, and he was telling us that about the glorious power of prayer that's in us, that we can have anything that we wish in life, that all of our dreams can come true if we will but believe them, that we have been empowered to create incredible lives for ourselves. And listen to what he had to say in the 11th chapter of Mark. Listen to me! Exclamation point. You can pray for anything, italics, for emphasis. And if you believe, italics, exclamation point, you have it. It's yours. You pray for anything. But wait a minute, he said, there's one condition. You can't have anything that you want until you forgive everyone for everything they've ever done. He said, before you pray, first forgive anyone you're holding a grudge against. Go to them and forgive them. Go to them, go to where they are. Wait till you meet them on an elevator in a department store. Oh, no. Go to them inside yourself and forgive them. Because until you do, you will not be released. And you cannot rise up and experience the glory that has been prepared for you. You've heard the story in song that Tony Orlando made famous, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. Heard it? It came from a true story. And Robert Schuller tells that story again in his book, The Be Happy Attitudes. It seems that 3 teenagers boarded a bus in New Jersey, and seated on the bus was a quiet, poorly dressed man who sat alone and was silent. And when the bus made its first stop along the way, he did not get off. Everyone else did. And when the kids got back on, one of them looked at him and smiled, and he hung his head and did not smile back. At the next bus stop, as everyone else got off, the last teenager turned and said to the man, "Why don't you get off with us and stretch your legs and be comfortable?" And he felt the warmth of the invitation, and he did get off. And while they were outside, they began talking, and in their enthusiasm about their first trip to Florida, they told him the excitement that they had to see orange trees for the first time, to be on a beach. He said, "I used to live in Florida. This is a wonderful place." And they said, "Do you have a home there? Do you have a family?" And he said, "I don't know. I don't know whether I do or not." And they said, "What do you mean?" And they insisted and persisted until finally, caught up in their warmth and sincerity, he shared this story with them. He said, "Many years ago, I was sentenced to a federal prison. I had a beautiful wife and wonderful children. And before I left, I said to her, 'Honey, don't write to me, and I won't write to you. The kids should not know that their dad is in prison. They should not have to suffer because of what I have done, nor should you. So I would like for you to go ahead and begin to live your life all over without me. And if you find another man, somebody who will be a good father to those boys, why, don't hesitate to take him as your husband.'" And he told the teenagers, he said, "I don't know whether she kept her bargain or not, but I kept mine. I have not written to her until last week when I knew for sure that I was getting out. I sent a letter to my old address, which was just outside Jacksonville, Florida. And I said to her, if you're still living there, and get this letter, if you haven't found anyone else, and if there's a chance of you taking me back, here's how you can let me know. I will be on the bus as it comes through town. I want you to take a piece of white cloth and hang it in the old oak tree right outside of town." And so as they were approaching Jacksonville, when they were about 10 miles out of town, the teenagers came over to his side of the bus, and they were eagerly looking out of the window. And suddenly, they yelled and jumped and screamed and hugged each other and danced in the aisle, and all that they could say was, "Look at it, look at it." You see, not a single white cloth was tied to the tree. There was a white bed sheet, A white dress, the little boy's white trousers, white pillowcases. The whole tree was covered with dozens of pieces of white cloth. And that's the way it is with us. That's the way that God treats you and me. It's a promise to God that the past has been forgiven and erased from the record that we've rolled up. It's the promise to the prodigal in us. But it's more than that. It is more than a promise that we will just live ordinary lives. It is a promise that we will transcend our present state when we can forgive us and can forgive them. His son said to him, "Father, I have fallen short in every possible way, and I'm not worthy of being called your son." But his father said to the slaves, "Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him, and a jeweled ring for his finger and shoes, and kill the calf that we have in the fattening pen. We must celebrate with a feast. The son of mine was dead, spiritually dead, and has returned to life. He was lost and is found." And so the party began. There's magic, absolute magic, in forgiveness. And if you don't believe it, and you have a garnet, try it. God bless you.